Welcome to Targeted, True Crime, Domestic Violence. We tell stories of women, men, and children who were targeted by domestic abuse. We investigate cases of family violence each season using academic research to help us interpret the events. This podcast discusses very sensitive information about abuse and violence. Although I strive for respect and balance, some details may be graphic and listener discretion is advised. I'm Mo Blackwell, the host of Targeted. I created the Targeted podcast because I'm a college professor, and I think we need to stop making family violence a secret. It's time for us to tell our stories, reclaim our power, use our experiences to help, to heal, and to provoke change. Together, we can do it. An extra trigger warning for today. Today's episode is a frank description of the relationship between Tracey and Buck Thurman, including details of abuse. I try not to be gratuitous with descriptions, but I do think it's important that listeners understand what Buck did to Tracey when he targeted her for abuse. As the late 1970s came to a close, 17-year-old Tracey was a mama's girl in mourning. When her mother passed away from lung cancer, Tracey had been particularly close with her. In an interview in the Washington Post, Tracey said her mom was her whole life. In a family described as working class, education was not a top priority for Tracey, and she dropped out of school in Connecticut to move far, far away. Not wanting to stay home with the overwhelming memories of her mother, she landed in St. Petersburg, Florida for a complete change and began working as a housekeeper at a motel. This was 1979, a year of vast change, and despite various crises around the world, I still remember 1979 having a certain amount of optimism in it. Things would get better if you worked hard and held firm. Sure, life was hard, but we were strong. The soundtrack of our lives that year included Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive, The Eagles' Heartache Tonight, and Peaches and Herb's Reunited. Just as a little side note, Reunited was my favorite song as a girl. There are a lot of things happening in the country that were a little scary at the time. In California, we could only buy gas for our cars on every other day. If you had a license plate that was an odd number, you could only buy gas on an odd-numbered day. We would wake up early to take our car to the gas station before it opened and wait in line for an hour some days just to fill it up. When 3 Mile Island nuclear plant melted down in 1979, many people shrugged and said, they knew it was going to happen, because they had just seen the movie, The China Syndrome, which predicted a nuclear accident. And the U.S. hasn't started any nuclear plants since then. Yeah, there were some scary times. Yes, it was bad. But we just did what we had to do, and we moved forward. We were sure that things were going to get better. I imagine that this was the attitude of Tracey as she left to start a new life at only 17 years old. Yes, her life was sad. Yes, she missed her mother desperately, but she needed to just keep moving forward and things would get better. While working at the hotel, Charles J. Thurman, a construction worker, came into her life. He was staying in the motel with a construction crew. They were immediately attracted to each other, and the cocky young man wooed her. He easily and believably told her that he loved her, and he was very protective of her. Tracey said that he made her feel safe. In a 2008 article, Tracey said, quote, "It seemed like he cared. He was protective of me. I can't believe this, but I did actually feel safe." Unquote. She moved in with him after about 2 weeks and entered life on the road as she followed him to various construction jobs in multiple states. Their mobile lifestyle meant that Tracey didn't get to establish friendships or support systems outside of her boyfriend. It was the two of them together, alone. Buck, as Charles was usually called, had had a difficult childhood with an abusive father who was also an alcoholic. Buck was, however, very close with his mother, and this was something that spoke to Tracey, who still missed her own mom deeply. According to an interview in the Washington Post, Tracey said that Buck's father had gone through a successful rehabilitation program, and this provided an interesting frame for Tracey in which she saw a man who had been violent was rehabilitated and was no longer violent. Tracey empathized with Buck's early dysfunctional family. She was sorry for him that his childhood had been so difficult. She did see signs of anger in him, but they weren't directed at her so much as they were directed at a wall. She didn't like his temper, but she also wasn't unduly anxious about it. Instead, she thought he was foolish for hitting walls, not even thinking that his violence would escalate and that he would one day hit her. In a Chicago Tribune interview, Tracey said, quote, "It took me so long to leave because I knew what he had gone through as a child," unquote. The abuse didn't begin right away. Buck's protectiveness slid into control, and his temper edged into violence. In a 2008 interview, Tracey said, quote, "Back then, I just thought, you're an ass. I used to think, you're an immature jerk. I didn't look forward to see that could be me instead of the wall," unquote. Tracey found herself smack dab in the middle of phase 1 of Lenore Walker's cycle of violence. If you remember, Walker was one of the first researchers to identify and write about abusive relationships, and she wrote the book The Battered Woman in the 1970s. There's much about the book today that's simplistic, but it was revolutionary at the time. Dr. Walker talks about phase 1 as the tension-building phase. And it's the first time a target will experience the coercive control of the perpetrator, but doesn't recognize the long-term implications. The target hopes that the tension can be resolved, and when it does not, that's when phase 2, the physical abuse, begins. The first time Buck did hit Tracey, she was upset, but not unduly scared, and she characterized it as a smack. Tracey didn't understand that they had entered a new phase. She thought it was something that she could stop by responding back aggressively. She said, quote, "The first time he smacked me, I smacked him back," unquote. In a People magazine interview, Tracey said, quote, "The first few times, it was just an argument or something, and I slapped him back, and that was the end of it," unquote. This is not unusual. Domestic violence often begins with an assault that's mild enough so it doesn't completely freak out the target. And sometimes a target will decide to fight back physically, as Tracey did, or fight back verbally, such as telling the abusers, "Don't you ever hit me again." There's usually an apology as the perpetrator expresses sorrow for the violence, and the target leaves the abusive incident thinking that he or she has handled the problem, and it probably won't happen again. Tracey was optimistic. She loved Buck. Buck loved her. Buck apologized for his behavior and promised to do better, and thus they entered phase 3, the honeymoon phase. It's interesting that Dr. Walker considers the honeymoon phase to be a time when both the abuser and the target are in denial. They both minimize past abuse and are convinced that it will not happen again. The honeymoon may last long enough that the target relaxes, thinking that it's over. Once Buck became abusive, it may have been intermittent and less violent than his later behavior. Although Tracey contemplated leaving him, she did not. When she discovered she was pregnant, Tracey thought it was important for children to have both parents, and she determined to try and make the relationship work for the sake of her child. She was also a bit ambivalent about marrying Buck, saying she didn't really want to marry him, but she also wasn't ready to leave yet. She thought that having the child might change Buck's choice to behave violently. Like many targets, she also thought that her love would be enough to help Buck to change. On the one hand, there are some good reasons for her to think positively. First, she was aware of the change in her father-in-law. He had been abusive. He went to a rehabilitative program for alcohol abuse and seems to have changed afterwards. If you remember from last season, substance abuse problems are correlated with domestic violence. It's not the fault of the substances, it's how certain people interact with the effect of the substances. To say it another way, people who abuse are more likely to be substance abusers than those in the general population. It's not necessarily that alcohol or drugs cause violent behavior directly, but more that the substances may tamper our ability to effectively control impulses and aggression. It could also be that those with impulse control difficulties have just as difficult a time avoiding alcohol and drugs as they do controlling violent tendencies. The overall point is that Tracey knew Buck's father had been violent and had changed, so she had knowledge of someone who had transformed his life. Why wouldn't she think that Buck would change? There's a second reason why she might think that Buck would change, and I'll discuss that in the next episode. I want to focus more on Tracey's story. Tracey tried to make the relationship work so that her son would have both parents. Tracey did not stay long, however, as Buck continued to abuse her. Buck's behavior became increasingly violent. Research psychologist and criminologist Donna DeMond-LaPalme of Criminology wrote an article in 2016 arguing that Charles Thurman exhibited traits of paranoia and fit the criteria for paranoid personality disorder. And he not only exhibited this in his relationship with Tracey, but it was within all the areas of his life. Tracey left Buck and moved back to Connecticut to live with her family. Buck followed her to Connecticut, begged her to come back to him, apologized for his behavior, and proposed to her. He seemed sincere. Tracey accepted his proposal, and they married almost immediately when Tracey was 4 months pregnant. Tracey said she did not want to raise the child by herself. I think Tracey and Buck were in phase 3, the honeymoon phase, when Tracey married Buck. They had a quickie marriage ceremony and went right back to the life they had been living before, following Buck as he moved around from construction job to construction job. Their son, Charles Jr., whom they called CJ, was born. Instead of a child helping Buck to change for the better, Buck's behavior worsened and the abuse became more severe. Tracey began to live in near constant fear. She did not know what type of thing might set Buck off. He was unpredictable and violent. Tracey left at least 2 more times. Both times, Buck wooed her back and she returned, hoping this time he would be better. In an interview in People magazine, Tracey said, quote, "Then one night, after hanging out with some buddies, Buck returned home, and in the middle of my sleep, he choked me. My tongue was hanging out of my mouth and I was gasping for air. If I didn't kick him, he would have killed me. The look on his face, it was a blank look. I knew I had to get out." Unquote. 2 weeks later, in October 1982, she abruptly left Buck and moved back to her hometown of Torrington, Connecticut, yet again. At this point, Tracey has left Buck multiple times, at least 2 of which she decided to move back home to another state. Buck kept following her, though, avowing his love and promising to change. So it's taken a couple years and a bunch of attempts to leave before Tracey concluded that Buck had no incentive to change, and she was not willing to stay with him any longer. So this final time, as she left and returned to her family in Connecticut, she was not going to go back with Buck. Buck wasn't ready to give up, though. So again, he followed her home, but he could not persuade her to return. After their history, Tracey no longer believed that Buck would reform. It is in this fall, the fall of 1982, that Buck ratcheted up the abuse. While much of his previous abuse took place in the privacy of their home, he became comfortable assaulting her in the presence of other people. The following account that I'm going to give you merges court documents with information from interviews that Tracey's given, as well as news articles, in order to present one coherent timeline. You'll be able to see all of the sources on my website. In October of 1982, Tracey was staying at the home of her friends, Judy Bentley and Richard St. Hilaire, in an apartment in the city of Torrington. One day, Tracey heard a knock at the door, and she answered it, surprised to find Buck standing in front of her. Tracey wanted nothing to do with Buck, and she attempted to close the door without letting him inside. Enraged, Buck attacked her and grabbed her throat. Tracey managed to break free, to go inside without Buck, and call the police, who came, and they took Buck away from the property. About a half hour later, Buck went back to the apartment, banging on the door, seemingly trying to break it down. It was bad enough that Tracey and her friends barricaded the door and called the police again. The police came back, but this time they don't perceive what the problem is, because Buck is no longer banging down the door when they get there, and they decide not to do anything with Buck for his harassment or attacking of Tracey earlier. They don't even take Buck off of the property. Tracey's friends, Bentley and St. Hilaire, were upset about the lack of the police response, and as the property owners, they decided they would file a complaint themselves against Buck so that he couldn't set foot on their property again. It doesn't work. About a week and a half later, on November 1st, Buck returned to the apartment. This time he makes it past the front door, going inside. Once there, Buck grabs baby CJ and runs out of the apartment holding the baby. According to the formal complaint filed that day with the police, Buck announced to Tracey, quote, "If we can't bring up the baby together, no one will do it," unquote. Buck told Tracey that if she called the police, he would kill her. Tracey ignored the threat and contacted the police anyways. She makes it clear to the police that she is serious about her commitment to end the terror, saying, quote, "I want my husband arrested for threatening me and the baby. I will go to court," unquote. The police retrieved baby CJ and gave him back to Tracey, and apparently considered the incident resolved, as a court record indicates that no further action was taken. About this time, Buck worked in a restaurant called Ski's Diner, located a few blocks from the police station. Officers regularly came in to eat there. Buck worked at the counter as well as a short order cook, and he served many members of the Torrington Police Department. According to court documents, quote, "In the course of his employment, Buck boasted to the defendant police officer patrons that he intended to get his wife and that he intended to kill her," unquote. 2 days later, on November 3rd, 1982, Tracey called the police again and reported that Buck was making threatening phone calls. The police record her complaint in the official log, but do nothing else. A couple days after that, Buck returned to the home of Tracey's friends, the same one where he had attacked Tracey and kidnapped CJ from. He forced his way inside and took CJ again. Both Tracey and her friends went to the police station to make a formal complaint. At that point, the police officers of the city of Torrington refused to accept a complaint from Tracey. They also refused to accept a complaint from her friends about Buck's trespassing on the property. On November 5th, Tracey received a phone call from the city of Torrington. And at first, this seems like this is great news. Finally, the city of Torrington's police is contacting her. But no, it's not the police, it's the Family Relations Office. Buck had gone to the office seeking visitation rights, and the Family Relations Office wanted Tracey to come in so that they could hear her perspective before making a decision. Tracey drove to the office, which was located on the second floor of a municipal building, right above the police station. After the interview, she got into her car when she suddenly saw Buck in the parking lot of the police station. Buck swung his car in front of Tracey's and blocked her from leaving the parking lot. With Tracey trapped, he got out of his own vehicle, yelling threats at her. He smashes Tracey's windshield with his fist. He yelled, quote, "I will get you, and when I do, I will really hurt you," unquote. So get this. Buck carried out this assault in broad daylight in the parking lot of a police station right after trying to get custody of their son. Buck is out of control, and he doesn't even care that his actions are abusive, dangerous, or even that they're counter to his own interests. Many people, including a police officer, witnessed the attack and window smashing, but no one made an attempt to intervene or assist Tracey. The Court of Appeals transcript says, quote, "Police Officer Gamelli stood on the street watching Charles Thurman scream threats at Tracey until Charles Thurman broke the windshield of plaintiff Tracey Thurman's car while she was inside the vehicle," unquote. The officer did not do anything to help. Buck finally got into his car on his own and left. As soon as Buck was out of sight, Tracey exited her car, went into the police station, and filed a complaint. Finally, the police responded, and Buck was arrested on a breach of peace charge. So on the one hand, this is good news. The police finally responded. On the other hand, they charged him with breach of peace. What on earth is that? He was witnessed trapping her, breaking her car window, and threatening her. That was worth an assault charge, not a breach of peace charge. The next day, Buck was convicted of breach of peace, and he received a suspended sentence of 6 months and a 2-year conditional discharge, during which time he was ordered to stay completely away from Tracey Thurman and the Bentley St. Hilaire residence, which is her friend's apartment where she had been staying. So all he gets is a suspended 6-month sentence. That means he doesn't have to go to jail. And he's told, stay away from Tracey and her friends. That meant there was no felony conviction, no jail time, not even a formal restraining order. An additional requirement imposed by the court was that Buck was supposed to leave the city of Torrington, Connecticut, and go to live with his father in the state of Virginia. After his breach of peace conviction, there was a brief respite. Buck went 2 months without any incident. He didn't trespass, he didn't threaten, he didn't assault, he stayed away. Well, 2 months gave Tracey some breathing room. On New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1982, the brief calm was over. Tracey was still living with her friends at the Bentley St. Hilaire residence when Buck violated his sentence. He came to their apartment and once again threatened her. Tracey immediately called the Torrington Police Department. A police officer took the call, and although informed of the violation of the conditional discharge, he made no attempt to find out where Buck was or to try to arrest him. The police did nothing again. The very next day, on January 1st, 1983, Tracey looked out of the window and saw Buck standing under a streetlight. Tracey immediately called the police. By the time they arrived, though, Buck had already left. Tracey informed the police of the court order, but the police left without taking any action. The police log from that day contained the following note, quote, "Matter resolved for the time being. No formal complaint made," unquote. In other words, they did not arrest Buck for breaking the law. They didn't even try to find Buck or to warn Buck against making additional problems. They just let him be, which sent the message to Buck that he had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted with little or no consequences. For the next 3 months, the records show that Tracey made numerous telephone complaints to the Torrington police, but continued to threaten her both on the phone and in person, all of which were violating the terms of his probation. The police didn't respond, and they did not arrest, charge, or even speak with Buck. In the beginning of May 1983, Tracey and her friend went to the police station to file a complaint in person. They reported that Buck had come to the apartment and threatened to shoot both of them, and they believed that he was serious. Police officer Storrs refused to take the complaint from Tracey's friend, but he did accept a written complaint from Tracey. She asked for an arrest warrant to be issued for her husband due to the death threats, which violated the terms of his probation and his discharge. Officer Storrs refused to deal with the situation as exigent, meaning he didn't think there was any urgency to take action. Tracey was told to return in 3 weeks on June 1st, 1983, at which point Officer Storrs or someone else would seek a warrant for the arrest of Buck. Instead of waiting for 3 weeks, Tracey tried a different approach. Days later, on May 6, 1983, Tracey filed an application for a restraining order against Charles Thurman in the Litchfield Superior Court. The same day, the court issued an ex parte restraining order forbidding Charles Thurman, also known as Buck, from assaulting, threatening, and harassing Tracey. The court notified the City of Torrington police of the restraining order. With the granting of the restraining order, Tracey felt more support and decided to go ahead and file for divorce from Buck. When Buck learns of the divorce proceedings, he again ramps up his terror. Tracey becomes so frightened that she's confined to her friend's apartment where she's still living. On May 25th, a little more than 2 weeks after the restraining order is issued, Buck tells Tracey that he intends to kill her when the divorce is final. Again, Tracey calls the police and files a complaint. She calls and also requests an escort to the police station so she can file a request for an arrest warrant. The officers tell Tracey that she'll have to wait until after the Memorial Day weekend. Tracey waits a couple days, but it's urgent, and she doesn't think this can wait until after the holidays. So on May 27th, 1983, Tracey called again, and this time they provided a ride to the police station with a police officer, and she requested a warrant for Buck's arrest. Instead of doing it, though, the police tell Tracey that she has to wait until after the Memorial Day holiday weekend, and they advised her to call on Tuesday, May 31st, to pursue the warrant request. Obviously, this is frustrating and dangerous for Tracey. You may have noticed through all this that although Tracey is a woman of action, she really tried to obey the police's commands as much as possible. She waited until after the holidays, and first thing on May 31st, 1983, Tracey went once again to the Torrington Police Department to pursue the warrant request. When she got there, do you think they helped her? Yeah, no, they did not. A police officer told her that Officer Shapp was the only one who could help her, and that he was on vacation. So guess what? They said Tracey would need to wait until Officer Shapp returned from vacation. Tracey left the police station, frustrated and scared. She went to her family for support, and her family was shocked about the police's refusal to still arrest Buck, even though they led her to believe that it would happen if she waited until May 31st after Memorial Day. That same day, Tracey's brother-in-law, Joseph Coxis, called the Torrington Police Department to protest about the lack of action taken on Tracey's complaint. The police calmed him down and promised that Buck would be arrested within a week, specifically on June 8, 1983. So now Tracey and her family are thinking that if they just wait a few more days, Buck will be arrested. On June 5th, 6 days after the police refused to arrest Buck until an officer returned from vacation, Buck appeared outside of Tracey's window again. When he started to shout at her, she called the police, reminding them of Buck's release condition and the restraining order. The officers ignored Tracey's request for an arrest. The police log for that day reads, quote, "No formal complaint," unquote, even though Tracey repeatedly demanded Buck's arrest. June 8th comes and goes. That's the date the police promised Tracey's brother-in-law that they would arrest Buck. But they don't, and Buck remains free. On June 10th, 1983, 2 days after he should have been arrested, Buck appeared at the home of Tracey's friends where she was staying and demanded to speak to Tracey. And this is when all hell breaks loose. Tracey remained indoors, called the police department asking that Buck be picked up for violation of his probation. She asked them to come to the home immediately and help. Buck continued to harass her from outside, threatening to take their son and to hurt him. He was worse than usual, and Tracey thought she needed to calm Buck down before he broke in again. Buck was threatening to harm their baby, and Tracey saw that danger as imminent. It didn't seem like it was going to be one of those times when Buck would just leave on his own. 25 minutes after Tracey called the police, Officer Petrovitz, who had been out driving patrols in the area, arrives at the home. For some inexplicable reason, the officer decides to park across the street and stay in his patrol car to observe. While this is upsetting to Tracey, she does think there's an opportunity here, because one of the excuses the police had used before to avoid issuing an arrest warrant was that they had not personally witnessed the abuse. With the police officer watching, Tracey makes an impulsive decision. Buck is worse than usual, and Tracey can read him well enough to know that he's probably going to do something to attack her in some way, or at least threaten her, but now she will have the police officer observing, and this may make the difference. Because the officer is there, she doesn't think the danger is too great. Perhaps worst case scenario, he may punch her in the stomach. Tracey opened the door and calmly walked outside to ask Buck what he wanted. Buck doesn't waste time with talking, and without regard to the police officer, he approaches Tracey and takes out a knife. Tracey sees the knife and begins running away. She runs to the backyard of the apartment. Buck speeds after her in pursuit and steadily gains on her. He seized her and threw her to the ground. He stabbed her. He stabbed her in the neck. He stabbed her in the chest. He stabbed her in the throat, tearing open her esophagus. 13 times he stabs her, leaving 3 gaping holes. Although the officer was across the street, he later said that he did not see Buck assault Tracey. He must have had a clue that something was happening, though, because he did exit the car and he walked around to the back of the apartment. The officer saw the bloody knife in Buck's hand. When Buck looked up and saw the officer, he dropped the knife. The officer retrieved the knife, but made no move to restrain Buck. Later, the officer testified why he didn't arrest Buck. He said he didn't know that Buck had stabbed Tracey, and that the blood dripping from the kitchen knife was hers. The officer said, quote, "He could have stabbed a chicken. He could have stabbed a dog," unquote. Tracey laid on the grass, not moving, because she was afraid that moving might cause more blood loss and she would die. With the officer watching, Buck viciously kicks Tracey in the head. As his foot strikes her head, Buck damages her spinal cord, and then he runs into the home where Tracey had been staying. Buck grabs little CJ and tears back out into the yard where Tracey is laying, dying on the grass. The officer is still nearby, not offering any medical aid or protection to Tracey, although he did eventually call for an ambulance and backup. Buck came back to Tracey. He dumped the little boy on top of her, yelling, quote, "I killed your effing mother," unquote. And then he kicked her in the head again. The officer still makes no move to restrain Buck, and the angry man stalks around the yard, still yelling and still threatening Tracey. 3 more officers arrive at the scene and they observe Buck, but none made any move to restrain or arrest him. Court documents later say that some of the police who were on the scene knew Buck from his job at Ski's Diner, which may have influenced their decision not to act. A crowd starts to form, and Buck freely moves around the people, still clearly dangerous. After about 50 minutes, medical help arrived and Tracey is loaded onto a stretcher. As she is about to be carried away, Buck, who is still moving about the yard, rushes to her side. He started to climb into her ambulance, about to attack her one more time, when finally, the police arrest Buck. Tracey is taken to the hospital, near death. Thanks so much for joining us at Targeted Podcast, True Crime, Domestic Violence. If you're interested in my sources or research, I include a bibliography on my website, www.targetedpodcast.com. You can also find all of the episodes there if you want to listen online. If you're looking to connect with others who listen to the show, please consider joining our closed Facebook group called Targeted Podcast. Just request to join, and you will be approved. You can tweet at me on Twitter. My handle is Targeted Podcast. Please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or any podcast app that you use, and writing a sentence or two about what it is that you like. It really helps other listeners to find us. And if you have constructive criticism, I do want to hear it, but I'd appreciate it if you could email it to me at targetedpodcast@gmail.com. If you live in the southern United States, Targeted Podcast is going to participate in the Great Southern True Crime Podcast Meetup on Saturday, October 13th, 2018 in Atlanta, Georgia. I think it's going to be an amazing meetup with a lot of your favorite podcasts represented, including The Fall Line, Southern Fried True Crime, Trace Evidence, Corpus Delicti, Moms and Murder, Pleasing Terrors, and a northern podcaster is even coming down to join us, Already Gone. I hope that you'll come to mix and mingle with hosts and fellow fans alike. I'd love to meet you. Please stay tuned for promos at the end of the podcast and check them out if they sound interesting. I'll include links to them in my show notes. As we end, let me emphasize that if you or someone you know is targeted by abuse, you are not alone. There are resources and people available to you. I've included some contact information in my show notes and on the website about organizations in the United States. If you live in another country and you know of an excellent organization that helps targets of domestic violence, please send me the information for possible inclusion on the website as well, because I'd love to include additional information for international listeners. Leaving an abusive relationship can be one of the most dangerous times for a target, and I strongly encourage you to reach out for support. It may be the hardest thing you ever do, but it will be worth it. I'm Mo Blackwell, the host of Targeted. Peace, my friends. Peace.
This was a very memorable, shocking, and bizarre crime that happened.
Seems almost too bizarre to be true.
Charged in a bizarre,
accused of dressing up as a clown.
The bizarre twist in this story.
Got the break they needed in this bizarre case.
The damage that this man has caused so far.
We've never seen anything like this.
Welcome to Beyond Bizarre True Crime. These are the stories that'll make you wonder if they came from Hollywood or if Hollywood took it from them.
Available on your favorite podcast app or online at Beyond Bizarre True Crime.